You know those moments when everything seems normal, like you're living your life in a bubble of peace and tranquility? That was me, right before Karen came into the picture. I'd just finished setting up my garden, or as I like to call it, my flower sanctuary. Not just any flowers, mind you, these were special. You see, my garden wasn't your typical rose bush and daisy-filled plot. No, it was a place of peculiar and enchanting flowers, each with a history as rich as the soil they grew in. These flowers had been passed down for generations, cultivated in secrecy by my family and nurtured with a careful touch. At first glance, they were breathtaking, vibrant purple vines that spiraled up toward the sky, deep blue flowers that almost seemed to glow in the moonlight, and black tulips with edges that shimmered like obsidian. Each one had its own little legend, its own secret power. Some believed they brought good fortune, others feared they could curse anyone who dared to approach them. But for me, they were a form of art, a piece of my family's legacy. That was until Karen moved in next door. Now, Karen wasn't the kind of person you'd expect to be bothered by a garden. On the surface, she was the perfect suburban neighbor. She had a perfectly manicured lawn, a pristine white picket fence, and an immaculate rose garden. She often boasted about her flowers, all classy and traditional, a far cry from my wild and unconventional blossoms. At first, I thought she was just another one of those nosy neighbors, always peering out of her window to see what I was up to, but things quickly escalated. One morning, as I was out tending to my garden, I heard her voice, sharp like a nail on a chalkboard, calling over from the fence. "Honestly, what is that?" she asked, pointing at a cluster of deep crimson roses that seemed to throb with an unnatural pulse. Her words were laced with disgust, like she had smelled something foul. I raised an eyebrow, glancing over at her. "These are just my flowers," I said, trying to keep it casual. "They're unique." "Unique?" she scoffed. "That's one way to put it. They're hideous. What are you even doing with these? They're creepy. You should take them down before the whole neighborhood thinks you've gone insane." I was taken aback. Sure, my garden wasn't your typical neighborhood flora, but I had never expected anyone to be offended by it. I thought she was just being Karen, picky, critical, the type to complain about anything that wasn't up to her standards. But as the days passed, Karen's comments grew bolder. Every time I was outside, she'd poke her head over the fence and make a snide remark about how tacky my garden looked. "You really shouldn't be growing flowers like that in a family neighborhood," she'd say. "It's like you're inviting bad energy into your life." She even went so far as to say that my garden was ruining the aesthetic of the neighborhood. I let it slide, figuring she'd eventually lose interest. But one afternoon, as I was trimming the ivy that had grown around my garden stone fountain, I looked up to see Karen standing by the gate, a shovel in hand, an unmistakable look of determination in her eyes. "Karen, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice tinged with confusion. "I'm taking matters into my own hands," she said, her tone cold, her lips curled into a tight smile. "These flowers need to go. I'm not going to let them ruin the vibe of this street anymore." My stomach twisted. I could already see the trouble brewing. "You can't just take my flowers," I said, feeling a flare of anger rise in my chest. "This is my property. You can't just destroy things because you don't like them." She didn't listen. With a swift motion, she jabbed the shovel into the soil, aiming right for the base of one of my prized flowers, a black orchid with petals that shimmered like the night sky. The flower seemed to shudder, almost as if it could sense the attack. But it was too late. The shovel cut through the soil, and the flower was torn from the ground. "Karen, stop!" I shouted, rushing towards her. But before I could reach her, something strange happened. The flower that Karen had uprooted seemed to pulse with an eerie light. The air around it grew thick, heavy with a strange energy, and I could feel a cold chill creeping up my spine. Karen froze, a look of confusion spreading across her face. "What the hell is happening?" she muttered, taking a hesitant step back. And then, to my horror, the flower didn't die. No, it didn't wither. It began to grow. The soil around it started to tremble, and before Karen could even react, tendrils of dark green vines shot up from the ground, wrapping around her legs like thick ropes. The flowers themselves seemed to stretch and sway, their petals twisting unnaturally. The once peaceful garden had turned into something far more sinister. Karen screamed, her voice high-pitched and frantic, but the vines only tightened. The more she struggled, the stronger they grew. My heart raced, my mind spinning in confusion. What had I done? What was happening? The garden was never meant to be a threat. It was never meant to do this. But now, as Karen thrashed helplessly, I knew something was terribly wrong. Something had been awakened by her intrusion. And as I stood there, watching the vines tighten around her, I realized I had underestimated my garden. And it wasn't just flowers anymore. I stood frozen, unsure whether to scream or run, as Karen continued to thrash wildly against the vines constricting around her. Her arms flailed in panic, her face turning an alarming shade of red as the vines spiraled up her body like snakes, tightening with each desperate struggle. "Get them off! Get them off me!" she shrieked, her voice breaking with terror. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This wasn't just some strange coincidence or my mind playing tricks on me. The flowers, my flowers, had come to life. It wasn't like any ordinary garden. This was something far older, far more dangerous. They were angry, and I had no idea how to stop them. "Please," Karen cried out, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me. I'll never complain about your stupid flowers again. Just make them stop." I felt a pang of guilt. Was I supposed to help her, my neighbor, my annoying, critical neighbor who had been mocking my garden for weeks? But she was also human. She had no idea what she had unleashed by messing with my flowers. As much as I loathed the woman, it wasn't in me to let her suffer. I stepped forward, carefully walking closer to where she was now tangled in the writhing vines. Her attempts to pry them off were futile. They seemed to grow stronger the more she fought them. It was as though the plants were feeding off her fear, growing faster with each scream that left her mouth. "Karen, stop moving," I shouted, though my voice was trembling too. The sight was too surreal. It felt like something out of a nightmare. "Just calm down. I'll figure this out." Her frantic eyes met mine, and for a moment there was an almost pleading look in them. I didn't know if she was asking for help or if she was just scared. I hesitated, unsure what to do next. The garden, my garden, was no longer a place of beauty. It had become something monstrous. The flowers were twisting and growing unnaturally fast. The once soft petals now sharp, as if the plants were weaponized. They were alive, and the vines were sentient. There was no denying it now. I had to do something. "Look, I don't know how to stop them," I said, more to myself than to Karen. My hands were shaking as I knelt beside her, trying to tug at the vines that were choking her. It felt like they were made of steel, unyielding, impossible to break. "Please help me." Karen's voice cracked as she strained against the tightening grip of the vines. A sudden realization hit me like a cold splash of water to the face. I wasn't going to stop them, not unless I knew how, and I didn't. I looked around desperately for anything that might give me a clue. That's when I noticed the ancient stone plaque at the far end of the garden, near the hedge. I had never paid much attention to it. It was covered in vines and moss, but the symbols on it were unmistakable. It was a warning. The plaque, now revealed under the shifting light, was engraved with strange, almost indecipherable symbols. Words that didn't belong in this world. Words that had been hidden for centuries. The language of the plants. The language of the curse. "Karen, hold on," I shouted, scrambling towards the plaque. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me as I desperately ran my fingers over the carvings. What was this? What had my ancestors been involved in? I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The garden had been in my family for generations, passed down from one person to the next. My great-grandmother had planted the first seeds. She had always warned me to be careful with them, to respect them, but she never mentioned anything about curses or magic. But now it was clear. The flowers weren't just flowers. They were a link to something darker. I knelt beside the plaque, pulling at the ivy that had grown over it, revealing more of the ancient symbols. The more I uncovered, the more the vines in the garden seemed to stir restlessly, as if they could feel the words being revealed. The air grew colder, and the garden seemed to hum with energy. "Karen, you need to be quiet. Stop struggling," I said, even though I knew she was beyond hearing reason. She was caught in a panic, completely unaware of what was truly happening. The flowers, they had been feeding on her terror, growing in strength with each passing second. As much as I hated Karen for her constant, unsolicited comments about my garden, I knew I couldn't just let her be taken by the vines. Not like this. I leaned in closer to the plaque, brushing off the last remnants of moss. The symbols started to glow faintly, their edges shimmering with an otherworldly light. Slowly something shifted within me. I could feel the garden reacting, as if it were listening to me, as if it had heard something deep inside me. With trembling hands, I recited the words that had been inscribed on the plaque, despite my fear, despite the impossible nature of it all. By the roots of the earth and the spirits of the bloom, I command thee to stop. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. And to my shock, the vines immediately halted their movement. They seemed to pause, their tight grip loosening for just a moment. Karen, gasping for breath, fell to her knees, her body limp. "Did it work?" she gasped, her voice shaking, but I could hear the fear in it. She didn't know what had just happened. She didn't know what she had awakened. I took a step back, still unsure of what exactly I had just done. But as I did, I noticed something even more alarming. The flowers, once quiet and still, were beginning to bloom again, bigger, brighter, and more alive than before. The garden wasn't just growing, it was evolving. As the flowers bloomed with unnatural speed, a chill settled over the garden. It wasn't the usual cool, crisp air of evening. This felt different, like a shift in the atmosphere, a heaviness that pressed against my chest. The garden that had once been my sanctuary, beautiful, eerie, and misunderstood, had now become something far darker. I could feel it in my bones. Something had changed, and I had no idea if it was for better or for worse. Karen, still kneeling on the ground, looked at me in disbelief. Her hair was matted with sweat, her clothes damp from her earlier struggle with the vines. She had been quiet since I had recited those words, her panic turning into a strange, quiet dread as she watched the garden around us transform. What are they?" she whispered, her voice shaky. I could tell she was trying to make sense of what had just happened. "Why are they growing like that?" I didn't have an answer for her. In fact, I didn't even have an answer for myself. The flowers, which had once been tame, creepy, yes, but harmless, were now alive, twisting and swaying as though they were aware of us. Some of them seemed to reach out with their stems, as if beckoning us closer. "Stay back," I warned Karen, stepping in front of her, as if I could protect her from the madness that was now unfolding. The flowers might have been under my command, but that didn't mean they wouldn't react to her presence. They seemed to thrive on her fear, their petals opening wider in response to the slightest hint of anxiety. I was starting to think that I had just barely managed to keep them at bay with my ancient incantation. "What is this?" Karen demanded, her voice still trembling. "What kind of garden is this?" I didn't know how to answer that. I didn't want to tell her that the flowers were older than anything she could imagine, that they were steeped in dark, forgotten magic. If I did, I would have to explain how my great-grandmother had been the one to plant them, how she had known what she was doing. She had always warned me not to touch them, not to tamper with their delicate balance, but I hadn't listened, and now here we were, standing in the middle of the consequences. I looked at the flowers again. Some of them had started to glow, soft, eerie light that pulsed from within their petals, like they were breathing. The garden was transforming before our eyes. The flowers that had once been static and dormant were now crawling up the hedges, reaching toward the sky, as if they were trying to claim the entire yard as their own. As there was an unsettling hum in the air, a vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The wind picked up, swirling around us with a force that made my hair stand on end. I turned toward Karen, my voice low but firm. "You need to leave, now." Karen's eyes widened in panic, but she didn't make a move. "I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, her voice rising in defiance. "You think you're going to get rid of me so easily?" Before she could finish her sentence, one of the flowers snapped out of the ground with a sudden jerk, as if it were alive and angry. The large blossom unfurled, its petals sharp and spiny like a weapon, and it lunged toward her as though it were reaching for her throat. Karen screamed, jumping back, but the flower was too fast. It wrapped around her wrist with an almost serpentine speed, pulling her toward the ground. I could feel the power surge within the garden, a dark pulse in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Let go of her," I shouted, stepping forward. The words came from somewhere deep inside me, almost instinctively, and for a brief moment the flower paused, as if it was considering my command. But then it tightened. I reached out, grabbing Karen's other arm and trying to pull her free from the flower's grasp. It was impossible. The flower was too strong. "Please, help!" Karen cried again, her voice strangled. I could see her face turning pale as the plant squeezed tighter. The glow from the flowers around us intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced across the garden, filling the air with an oppressive energy. The vines from earlier slithered through the garden, twisting and tangling around my legs, trying to keep me in place. I had no choice but to act quickly. I looked around, desperately. The plaque. Where was the plaque? I needed to see it again, to understand the symbols, the words that might hold the key to controlling the flowers. There had to be something, anything, that could stop this madness. I pushed Karen aside just enough to break her contact with the flower's tendrils and sprinted toward the stone plaque. My heart was racing. Every step I took was filled with dread, and yet there was also a sense of urgency. I had to figure this out. The curse wasn't over. It had only just begun. "Get away from that," Karen shouted, but I didn't listen. I couldn't afford to. I knelt before the plaque, my fingers trembling as I traced the lines of the symbols. They seemed to pulse under my touch, almost as if they were alive. My thoughts were scattered, but then, as if in some strange moment of clarity, I remembered the last part of the inscription I hadn't read aloud, the final piece of the puzzle. I recited the last line, the words foreign on my tongue, but somehow they felt right. "The roots are deep, the bloom is cursed, the curse will break only with the light of the moon." At that exact moment, the garden seemed to shift. The flowers recoiled slightly, the glow dimming as if they were reacting to the power of the words. The vines loosened their grip on my legs, and Karen's wrist was freed from the flower's grasp. She stumbled back, gasping for air, and I pulled her toward me. The flowers were still alive, but now they seemed to be under some sort of restraint. Their aggressive growth slowed, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for the moon to rise. The night was settling in, and the moon, full and luminous, began its climb into the sky. As the pale light bathed the garden, I could feel a shift. The garden seemed to breathe, exhaling in waves of cool air, and the flowers, those cursed, beautiful horrors, grew still. It was as if they were waiting for something, but waiting for what? I stood there with Karen beside me, both of us staring at the flowers in silence. The tension was palpable, the weight of the moment pressing down on us. Every inch of me wanted to run, to grab Karen and flee from this cursed place, but I knew better now. Running wouldn't solve anything. We had to face it head on. The moonlight fell on the plaque in the center of the garden, casting eerie shadows around us. The words I had spoken earlier hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The roots are deep. The bloom is cursed. The curse will break only with the light of the moon. I hadn't understood them fully at the time, but now, standing under the full moon's glow, they felt as if they were written specifically for this moment. Why is it still here?" Karen muttered, her voice trembling with disbelief. She couldn't look away from the garden, from the strange flowers that had once been so harmless, so charming. The blooms now towered over us, their twisted petals reaching for the sky like dark sentinels guarding at the garden's secrets. I didn't answer right away. There was nothing I could say that would make this easier for her to understand. I could tell she was still reeling, still processing the events of the evening, but the reality was inescapable. There was something in this garden that had been unleashed, something far beyond our control, and it wasn't going away. But even as I stood there, trying to make sense of everything, I knew there was only one thing left to do. I I had to break the curse, and I had to do it before the flowers grew even more powerful. The garden felt different under the moonlight. It no longer felt like an ordinary garden, if it ever had. It was alive, its energy crackling through the air. The plants seemed to shift as if they were moving with purpose, watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. I could sense the roots beneath the soil, stretching out like veins, deep and endless. The flowers, no longer just odd decorations, were part of something far older and far darker than I had ever imagined. "Do you feel that?" I whispered to Karen, my voice barely audible over the rustling of the leaves. She nodded, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Yeah," she said, her voice shaking. "It's like the whole garden is alive." I nodded, my heart racing in my chest. She didn't understand fully, and I wasn't sure if I did either. But one thing was certain. The garden was feeding off our fear, growing stronger with every moment of hesitation. "Listen," I said, turning to her, trying to steady my voice. "The only way to stop this is to face it head on. The curse. It's not just about the flowers. It's about what's buried beneath them, what they were planted to protect. We need to stop it before it takes over everything." Karen didn't respond at first. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with terror. But after a long, tense pause, she nodded slowly. She wasn't just scared now, she was terrified, and rightfully so. The flowers were no longer a curiosity. They were a threat, and I had no idea how we could undo what had been done. I turned back toward the garden, focusing on the largest flower, the one that had grown the tallest and most menacing. It seemed to watch me, its petals now opening wider, as if sensing my intentions. It was a flower of power, one that pulsed with an energy I couldn't explain. It wasn't just a flower anymore. It was something else, a vessel for something ancient, something powerful. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and I could hear the faint sound of whispering in the wind. The flowers, in response to my focus, began to shake. The petals twisted and turned as though they were preparing for something. "What's happening?" Karen asked, her voice trembling again. "What's going on?" But I couldn't answer her. I was too focused on the flower, too focused on the energy building within the garden. The curse wasn't just in the garden, it was in the land itself, in the very soil that had nourished these plants for so long. The flowers, it seemed, were just the surface, the mask for something far more sinister. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. If I had to face the curse alone, I would, but I knew Karen wouldn't let me do this without her. She was still standing beside me, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too, something that resembled determination. "We can't let it win," I muttered, more to myself than to her. I closed my eyes and spoke the final words of the incantation, the words that I had been holding back all night. "By moon's light, by roots of old, let this curse be broken. Let its power unfold." As the words left my lips, the garden shuddered. The flowers froze, their petals snapping shut like jaws closing in on their prey. The vines that had been creeping through the soil recoiled, pulling back as if repelled by an unseen force. The air became still, heavy with the weight of magic, the weight of ancient power. For a moment, everything went silent. And then, with a suddenness that left my heart racing, the garden seemed to explode into motion. The flowers, no longer twisted and corrupted, began to bloom, beautiful, vibrant, and alive in a way that they had never been before. The curse was broken. The garden, once a source of fear, had become something else entirely. It was a new beginning. And as I stood there, the first light of dawn beginning to break over the horizon, I realized that the garden had been more than just a place of darkness. It had been a test, one that we had passed together. And in the end, Karen and I had both learned something important. Never underestimate the power of the garden. The garden was no longer a place of horror. It was a place of peace, a place where the flowers could thrive, free from the curse that had bound them for so long, and that in itself was a miracle.